Welcome, everyone, to the Wilmot Institute's first dialogue webinar. The theme of this series is Global Challenges and Opportunities, highlighting not just the threats and dangers humanity faces, but also the potential solutions. And in the coming weeks and months, we will examine such challenges as the coronavirus pandemic, climate change, the dysfunction we have at the international level, racism, gender inequality, and the extremes of wealth and poverty. Basically, for global challenges, we will be reviewing most of the issues raised by the Promise of World Peace, which was the peace statement that the Universal House of Justice, the supreme governing body of the Baha'i faith, wrote in 1986, a list of challenges that really in some ways haven't changed very much in the 30 years since. The goal, of course, will always be to find opportunities to solve or mitigate the challenges and not just to talk about the challenges themselves. And I should add that since this is a dialogue webinar, we will be keeping the presentations relatively short, 10, 15 minutes, maybe 20 at the most, so that we can maximize the amount of time for Q&A. Tonight's program will feature Christine Muller, a musician turned climate change activist, a phrase she says she doesn't like to use for herself, but we can use it for her if we wish. And she will speak about the Baha'i perspective on global risks, utilizing a global risk report compiled by the World Economic Forum. She will, I'm sure, explain to us what the World Economic Forum is and what their interest in global risks is at some point in this presentation. Next week, we will have the first of 3 presentations by Soveda Maani Ewing, and they will occur on Wednesday nights like this one on April 7th, 14th, and 21st. Soveda's first presentation will be called The Coronavirus Pandemic, Stepping Stone or Stumbling Block. And you can register all 3 of them at once if you go to our website and look for the WI Live page. The dialogue series will also be broadcast live over Facebook and YouTube. And of course, it will be recorded so that you can watch it later on YouTube if you're unable to watch all of them live. If for some reason we fill up, our capacity is now 500, so it's unlikely, but you can always just go to Facebook or YouTube and watch it live there if for some reason you can't get in. So that's useful to remember. We are designing this series for a general audience, so invite your friends and colleagues to tune in as well. Before we begin, I should probably remind everyone to keep yourselves safe during this global pandemic. Stay at home, minimize contact with people outside your immediate family. Be sure to stay at least 2 meters or 6 feet from anybody when you're in public, and wash your hands frequently. With measures such as these, we'll protect ourselves and as many people as possible from illness and possible death, especially the elderly and those who have compromised health systems. So without further delay, I will now turn to Christine Muller and her presentation on a Baha'i perspective on global risks. Christine, thank you very much for joining us and being our first guest on this Global Challenges and Opportunities dialogue webinar. We're delighted to have you and very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Robert, for inviting me, and thank you for the opportunity for us to have these conversations on matters of global concern. While all our attention today is on the coronavirus, it may be meaningful to take a moment to have a broader look at the state of our world and reflect on the spiritual significance of our time. In today's conversation, we will have a brief look at the Global Risks Report 2020 issued by the World Economic Forum and share what the Baha'i teachings say about potential future challenges. Baha'u'llah has warned us repeatedly of a great calamity that will engulf humankind, of a severe crisis that will shake up human consciousness, and that it will force humans to come together to solve its problems. He wrote, "The world is in travail, and its agitation waxes day by day. Its face is turned towards waywardness and unbelief. Such shall be its plight, that to disclose it now would not be meet and seemly." Many of you are familiar with this and similar statements by Baha'u'llah. The coronavirus has taken us by surprise. It points out the importance to think about the problems of our age and about the many other serious risks to humankind. So let's take a moment to reflect what today's major risks and challenges are. If we were together in a face-to-face conversation, I would ask you to brainstorm, and together we would come up with quite a long list. But for now, just try to think on your own of 2 or 3 major challenges to humankind. Each year, the World Economic Forum conducts a global risks perception survey, a survey which asks global experts and decision makers to rank their top concerns for the next decade. These are the 10 most anticipated short-term risks in 2020. I let you read them on your own. The top 2 short-term risks are economic and political, followed by 2 environmental issues. Of course, this report only provides a risk assessment. It cannot predict the future. The risk of infectious diseases, for example, did not make it into the projected 10 highest risks in 2020. This slide shows the long-term risk outlook by likelihood over the next decade. 1 decade is not really very long-term, but it is compared to the time frame that is usually considered by politicians and businesses. Please take a moment to read them now. As you can see, in the long term, the top 5 risks by likelihood are all environmental. Now let's move to the top 10 long-term risks by impact. These long-term risks by impact are probably the ones we need to take the most serious. Here, 4 out of the 5 top risks are environmental. When the World Economic Forum first launched the Global Risks Perception Survey in 2006, economic risks filled most of the top spots by likelihood and impact. In 2020, for the first time, the Global Risks Report is dominated by the environment, especially by climate-related issues such as extreme weather and water crises. So, what do the Baha'i teachings say about global risks to humankind? Already in 1957, Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, listed the signs and portents that must either herald or accompany the calamity Baha'u'llah announced. That's, of course, another perspective on global challenges than the one from the Global Risks Report, and therefore not comparable. Shoghi Effendi listed the following signs that must herald or accompany calamity. The violent derangement of the world's equilibrium, the trembling that will seize the limbs of mankind, the radical transformation of human society, the rolling up of the present-day order, the fundamental changes affecting the structure of government, the weakening of the pillars of religion, the rise of dictatorships, the spread of tyranny, the fall of monarchies, the decline of ecclesiastical institutions, the increase of anarchy and chaos, the extension and consolidation of the movement of the left, the fanning into flame of the smoldering fire of racial strife, the development of infernal engines of war, the burning of cities, the contamination of the atmosphere of the earth. Shoghi Effendi wrote this in 1957. Let's briefly think about the last topic. How can we understand the contamination of the atmosphere of the earth from a 2020 perspective? Different things can come to our mind here. The widespread serious air pollution, the threat of nuclear contamination, the depletion of the ozone layer, and the most consequential one is the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which cause global warming. And the warming of the earth, of course, results in the climatic changes and natural disasters, which we have already begun to experience. Now, the words of Shoghi Effendi have a silver lining because he writes that these problems may contribute to a great calamity which must purge the human race of the dross of its age-long corruptions and weld its component parts into a firmly knit, world-embracing fellowship. So humankind needs to be purified by suffering and will be forced to come together as one. Shoghi Effendi further elaborated on this theme in a letter written in 1936. Much suffering will still be required ere the contending nations, creeds, classes, and races of mankind are fused in the crucible of universal affliction and are forged by the fires of a fierce ordeal into one organic commonwealth, one vast, unified, and harmoniously functioning system. In the same paragraph, Shoghi Effendi continues, adversities unimaginably appalling, undreamed of crises and upheavals, war, famine, and pestilence might well combine to engrave in the soul of an unheeding generation those truths and principles which it has disdained to recognize and follow. The paragraph ends with, a paralysis more painful than any it has yet experienced must creep over and further afflict the fabric of a broken society ere it can be rebuilt and regenerated. Now, the coronavirus may be shaking people up from their paralysis. Of course, there is also the danger that we forget about other global problems because of it. And all of these problems are intricately connected. We can see this interconnectedness in the current health crisis. It is quite likely that it will lead to a serious economic crisis and exacerbate poverty and inequality. Violence and political upheavals cannot be ruled out. The interconnectedness can also be seen in that, since the coronavirus outbreak, scientists have reported a decrease in air pollution and carbon emissions around the world. You can now see fish swim again in the clear water of Venice, and China's CO2 emissions are down by a quarter. Of course, temporary reductions of carbon emissions will not solve the climate crisis, but the pandemic is an opportunity for humankind to wake up and face the reality of the state of our world. To close, I would like to point out 3 hopeful signs or aspects. First, because many social and environmental issues are connected, we can work on them simultaneously. People can be empowered with education about sustainable agriculture and forestry to alleviate malnutrition and poverty, and at the same time mitigate climate change. Building a clean energy infrastructure and sustainable production will create jobs and provide livelihoods for people. More people growing some of their own food will make them more resilient and will result in less carbon pollution. Collaborating in community gardens can bring people from different backgrounds together and build community. More people walking and biking will contribute directly to their physical and mental health because of exercise and fresh air, and indirectly because of cleaner air due to less car emissions, etc. While the virus will not save the climate, the human response to it shows that we are able to make enormous changes in the way we live within a short period of time, if we truly realize the threat. The capacity for fundamental change exists. And of course, there is great urgency for very strong climate action. We need to adopt sustainable lifestyles so that we live within planetary boundaries and can limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. This is absolutely essential to avoid increasing human suffering for decades and centuries, and even the collapse of civilization. The current health crisis provides the opportunity and the motivation for people to reflect on the purpose of human life. Such a spiritual awakening is a prerequisite for solving humanity's problems. Racism, economic inequality, and the many environmental problems all come from an attitude of greed and exploitation. People exploit other people and nature at the same time. When we grow spiritually, we will change that attitude into caring for people and for nature. Hopefully, the unfolding crisis will accelerate our spiritual development so that humanity will rise up to take action to save itself from self-destruction and take the opportunity to build a society that is just and environmentally sustainable. I want to share with you one more quote by Shoghi Effendi. He said, its present state, he said that about humankind, its present state, indeed even its immediate future, is dark, distressingly dark. Its distant future, however, is radiant, gloriously radiant, so radiant that no eye can visualize it. At this stage of growing despair, we can bring hope and confidence in the future by providing a vision for a spiritual, socially just, and environmentally sustainable civilization. The Universal House of Justice wrote, "Vision must be restored where hope is lost, confidence built where doubt and confusion are rife." The current global health crisis will likely trigger enormous economic and political crises. This is an opportunity to engage more and more people in a conversation about the future we want and how we can get there. In all of our efforts to serve humankind, we can apply the Baha'i teachings. As Baha'u'llah said, these are not days of prosperity and triumph. The whole of mankind is in the grip of manifold ills. Strive, therefore, to save its life through the wholesome medicine which the almighty hand of the unerring physician hath prepared. Of course, if we want to administer a remedy, we first need to learn about the disease. We will have more such conversations with the Wilmed Institute to examine specific global challenges in more depth and discuss how we can apply the Baha'i teachings to them. That concludes my brief presentation. I hope that we can have a good conversation now, despite the limitation of not being together in person.
That's fantastic, Christine. I love the optimism and the you really brought together the Baha'i writings so marvelously about the challenges, the darkness of the more recent future, but the hope that we Baha'is have that humanity can get past this next century or two of grave difficulties, confusion, injustice and racism and economic exploitation and selfishness, and get to this point with the spiritualization of the masses, and people will no longer be inclined to do that as much. And people will be raised so that, as Abdu'l-Baha said, people won't even want to commit crimes because they'll just simply not see that as the way they should live. We're a long way from a culture like that, obviously, but that's where we hope humanity can go. So we do have some questions already. Someone has raised his hand, and I want to repeat that please don't raise your hand because we don't really know what to do with it. Just type in the chat box if you have a question, because that's the best way for us to be able to get questions and answers. We did receive one question by email, and actually a bunch of questions by email, and I thought I would rephrase a group of them this way for you, Christine. Many of these global crises that we face are expensive. Mitigating them is expensive. If we succeed to mitigate them, they affect our economic growth. Should we affect them now, spend the money and slow down our growth, or should we wait and deal with them when we're economically more capable? And that's, I think, the gist of several questions that we received by email tonight.
It's an interesting question, and maybe it will be nice to hear the views of others. So while I try to address the question in some ways, probably there are people who could write books on that question. But while I, address it briefly, maybe some of the participants can write into the chat box their view on that. My approach is that, first of all, it shows the need for consultation. And when we talk about how to address global crises, we need to have everyone affected from the local to the global level consult on the issues and to apply the principle of having the well-being of everyone in mind, of the poor who live today, as well as future generations. So, and of course, the economy is important in that it should provide the livelihoods for all people. But we cannot sustain unlimited economic growth anyway. That is a myth, and this is actually an opportunity to change our path as humanity and go away from that run to economic growth, which is self-destructive at this point, and try to address all of these issues with spiritual principles and the well-being of everyone in mind, social issues and environmental issues.
Sorry, I had trouble turning my microphone back on. Yeah, well phrased. And there was a couple of things here that I think I can deal with quickly. Someone asks about the slides, and we will have the slides available up on our website. Someone asked also about the extension and consolidation of the movement of the left and whether it refers to communism.
One comment about that whole list that Shoghi Effendi wrote, he didn't mean these are all bad things, although most of them certainly are. But he says these are the signs and portents that accompany or herald the crisis. So, we have, that's not a list of global problems, but it includes many problems. Yeah, personally, it depends how you interpret it, and everyone is free to interpret that by themselves. Personally, I think communism could be meant by this, but it could also be just generally the left movement and more social consciousness. So it and of course here we have both positive and negative. We know how much evil communism brought, but we also know how close the social teachings of the Baha'i faith are with social responsibility for the poor and equality, and so that's my personal
that's a good answer. And certainly when The Guardian wrote in the 1950s, I think, what was it, 57, you said, Razvan, 57 or whatever that year was.
Yes.
At that particular time, that's pretty much at the height of the Cold War. So there was certainly that context to keep in mind as well. One person asked, what was the asset bubble mentioned in the presentation? Remember?
I am not an expert in economy, but what I understand is that it's the whole financial system that is based on accumulating more and more debt, and that this is sooner or later destined to collapse. We just don't know when.
Yeah, I think the asset bubble in particular refers to the fact that assets have a certain value, for example, stocks or real estate. And the value of those properties are, to some extent, subjective. The thing that caused the 2008 financial crisis, one of the things that started was the huge increase in the value of real estate, to the point that it simply became unsustainable. When the value of real estate began to fall, this compromised the security of the banks, who were pretty much dependent on being able to cover the debts. People were no longer able to pay off their mortgages. So the asset bubble, I guess the first example of this in the 1600s was the value of tulips. I'm told in Holland, when they suddenly discovered tulips, everybody was trying to bid up the price of tulips to the point where the price of tulips got way too high and it crashed. So I think that's the asset bubble situation. Mark has an interesting question here. Sustainable development is based on the balance of the economy, the environment, and people. Historically, we focused on the economy, and recently, we are at the age of the Anthropocene that puts humankind at the forefront, perhaps based on the economy. We're out of balance. And so, yes, I think that's a good observation, that people are focusing so much on the economy, they're not paying attention to the environment or the people. I think that's basically his comment. Let's see. Is there an issue in the world that costs more than 1 year's worth of military expenses, military budgets put together? That's a really interesting question. I don't know how much money is spent per year worldwide on the militaries of the world. I suspect it's somewhere in the vicinity of $1 trillion. Since the United States, it's $500 billion, and the United States spends more than anyone else. It's a lot of money. Do you have any comment about the quantity of
maybe
money we need to spend to solve some of these problems?
Wahid, you may enjoy the book by Paul Handley. The book is called 11, and Paul writes in there about the military expenditures and how much we could save, and other ridiculous expenditures of humankind, like for cosmetics and sports and all things that we don't really depend on. Yeah, you will find numbers in there.
Yeah, Catherine Gibson has this comment. She says, it concerns me the way in which we measure economic growth. So much of it is based on consumerism without taking into the consideration the costs of doing so. For example, we don't measure the cost of pollution that is created by our inability to resolve our plastic waste, or the way in which we do not take into account the degradation of our water systems that cause health problems, a real cost to society not well measured by things like GNP, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, our economy would look very different if we included all these so-called externalities, the cost, the true costs to the environment, which is lastly also a cost to humankind, and then also the human exploitation, the human suffering that goes into many of the products that we consume. Most of the time we don't even know about it.
There was a reference on National Public Radio today about the fact that we really can't recycle plastic very effectively or cost effectively. That I think they said only 10% of all the plastic in the world that's produced is really the amount recycled, mm-hmm. and that millions of dollars has been spent by plastics companies to try and convince people that it's okay to use plastic because it will be recycled, and that way they're able to continue to sell plastic to the public, and the public doesn't feel guilty about buying it. It was a very interesting presentation on National Public Radio, a bit shocking actually.
Yeah, many of the recyclables used to be sent to China and Africa, including like toxic electronics, where people would dismantle them with their bare hand without any protection and get sick and pollute their water, and great problems. And now China said, we don't want to have your waste anymore. And now in Europe and in the United States, it's a big problem because all those recyclable materials are building up and there is no market for it anymore. So before, like our town could sell paper, for example, like for, I think, $80 per ton. And now they have to pay so that the paper will be picked up. Yeah. And we really don't know what is happening with all of it. Most of it, I don't think, is really recycled anymore these days. But that's again, as a society, we could put priority into recycling. We could incentivize these industries that do recycling properly and, and reuse these materials. Of course, it might be at the beginning more expensive to build this up. But if we want to, we see it now with the corona crisis, we can build new ventilators very quickly. We can also build up recycling industries. So,
well, and we can also choose which plastics we use. There are some plastics that are more recyclable than others, especially the ones that are made out of starch, which are basically plant-based plastics. Now that does compete for cropland, mm-hmm. of course, so that's another problem. But it may very well be that those are better to use in the long run. Mm-hmm. It may also be that you can incinerate a lot of this plastic and generate energy with it, though you do have to watch out about a lot of toxic gases that burning plastic produces. So I think you have to use a very high temperature and a lot of air to burn it properly. Someone made the comment, they looked it up, and the worldwide military spending in 2018 was $1.8 trillion. So that's when you think about it, a pretty shocking number. Someone else says, do you believe the increased use of surfactants, soaps from hand washing, and antibacterial waste are causing further problems in our H2O supply and other environmental balances?
Actually, that came to my mind too just recently. In the past days, I thought, well, but I personally don't use the disinfectant, which I don't recommend to others. I mean, please use the disinfectant. I just don't do that personally, but I do use a lot of Ivory Snow soap. But yes, because all these chemicals will end up. But I think right now we don't have a choice. But in general, I think in the household, it's better not to use that. Like if we don't have a crisis, it's better not to use these chemicals.
Soap is often good enough, and soap is more biodegradable, I would think.
There was one consumer report that I read that washing your hands carefully with soap is more effective than just spraying them with some disinfectant. Mm-hmm. However, they say they have not tested whether when you rub, the disinfectant, whether that would be more beneficial. So yeah, we don't really know a lot. That we don't really know about the effects on the environment yet.
One person, Greg, makes this interesting comment. One can get easily overwhelmed by the number and variety of problems that individuals, neighborhoods, cities, nations, and the world is dealing with. Do you have any wisdom to guide our actions? Perhaps a more balanced approach. Where to start?
I think it depends on our situation. I mean, all of us, we are individuals, so we can all do little steps and encourage others to do little steps, and many little steps together have an influence, and we can encourage our neighborhoods and our cities and our politicians to make bigger steps, and just change the consciousness and promote, the awareness of all these problems, and that we work together on solving them. I think that's the most important thing we can do.
I think in some ways things are getting more and more complicated, partly because problems are not being solved, and they are therefore becoming worse. And that, in some ways, makes things more and more complicated for us. And so we really have to tackle whatever we can tackle, it seems to me, as individuals. I don't know if people have been watching the TV show, Cat, excuse me. That's another interesting organic issue there. What's the show I'm thinking of? Oh, goodness. Never mind. I can't think of the name of the show, so I won't tell you. But it's all about going to the good place. It's about going to the good place versus the bad place. And they concluded that the reason fewer and fewer people are going to the good place is because there are more and more things counting against them. So that, for example, if they're just consuming things, they're now putting plastic in the environment and destroying the environment. So they're sinning and sinning worse and worse and worse all the time, because all these complicated things are happening around the world that they're now part of, and they're not opposing injustice. They're not resisting this problem or that problem. And so fewer and fewer people are able to get into the good place. And it was an interesting idea about how it's getting, in that sense, easier and easier to accidentally sin, because you simply can't solve all the problems around you, and whatever you do has unintended consequences. So in a way that relates to this question, I think. Let's see. Climate change has been the long, slow curve. The coronavirus, the fast break. It's caught the serious attention of the entire world in just 3 months. Mm-hmm. Good comment.
Right.
Wandra says, don't you think that perhaps when we get to the point that the world collectively focuses on these problems, that we might find there are solutions? Imagine the best minds of the world working on solving the problem of plastics, for example. However, without unity, we cannot solve these global issues.
Thank you, Wandra.
Yeah, and there was a comment that the man who was occupying the Baha'i Peace Chair before Hoda Mahmoudi, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but after Mr. Bushrui, Dr. Bushrui, he said something very interesting in an interview we did for him in World Order magazine. He said, every problem the world faces, someone has solved somewhere. Mm-hmm. Somewhere, someone has solved that problem. We just haven't been able to apply these solutions systematically. So you've got, deforestation. Well, we know how to reforest. when you think about it, and again, we know how to mitigate climate change. We know how to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by planting more plants. We know how to reduce pollution by having more efficient engines and by passing regulations and passing carbon tax. We know how to do these things, but we don't always have the will.
Right.
Some years ago, the Shah of Iran said that if every country gave 1 day's expenditure of their army to the United Nations, we could educate all the children of the world. Have you seen any move towards more on education and less on armaments? I don't think I've seen any move to do that, but lately the amount of money the governments are spending on armaments has been going up, if anything.
But it's a very important point, I think, that we need, like with education, we could have solved so many problems, including terrorism, and wars, conflicts, environmental problems. I mean, with education is really the key. And it's not just child education, it's continuing education also, everyone.
Absolutely. And people who are better educated, not just in the sense of PhDs and master's degrees, but in the sense of reading regularly and of making themselves aware about the world around them, they vote in a more enlightened fashion also. Politicians would find it harder to fool them because they have more knowledge about things. And this is something that we see in all political systems and all political parties. It's quite natural to want to cut corners and just simply make a simple argument in order to persuade a bunch of people to vote for you. And that's much more difficult to do when people are better educated. It seems to me that's something that you can see in The Secret of Divine Civilization that Abdu'l-Baha talks about as well. Someone here makes this comment that in Costa Rica, there's a literacy rate of 96%, making it the most literate population in Central America. And a little higher than that, the person was explaining why they were saying that, I think. The government of Costa Rica is famous for rejecting having any military at all, instead focuses on education, and that's why they have the high literacy rates that they have. And that's very true. That's a very good observation. The best intellects and well-trained minds have the technological know-how. Solutions are out there, but there needs to be an overarching motivation to unite thinking based on spiritual reality rather than the current value systems. I think that's true.
Great point, Peter.
Yes. More comments are coming in here. Let me see. I apologize that I've been sometimes skipping through these comments because, frankly, they've been coming in so fast I can't keep track of them because it keeps hopping, keeps jumping on my screen here. Greg says one can easily. Oh no, that's the one I read already. Go down a little farther here. Okay, here we are. When I look at the global map of the coronavirus, it is apparent that no borders exist. An acute increase in global and local cooperation has occurred, so we know it's possible. And that's certainly true. The coronavirus and the way it spread so quickly has shown us how difficult it is to prevent the movement of people and how quickly things can spread. It's now spreading in Africa, of course, more and more. And interestingly enough, since there's a lot more traffic between Africa and Europe than it is between Africa and China, the African cases are coming from people who came from Europe, who got it from people who came from China to Europe. So that's becoming an increasing problem. Peter says we need to move beyond zero-sum thinking. It focuses on establishing a them and us mentality. Catherine says, I think we might be vigilant about the way in which the lower automotive emissions that were to become law are being lifted by the United States administration under the guise of difficulties of the coronavirus, a false equivalency. As I understand it, also the argument is made that you're making cars more expensive and that's not good for people. But as I understand it, the amount of money you save on the higher fuel efficiency is greater than the increased cost of the manufacturing of the car. That's the argument that I heard today. Of course, if gasoline stays at $1.30 a gallon, that might not be true, but gasoline will not stay that low either. The Green New Deal, are you seeing some of these too? You want to read some of them, Christine? The Green New Deal addresses multiple problems simultaneously: the climate crisis, inequality, access to clean water, living wage jobs for all, etc. Learning about and promoting the Green New Deal and supporting the Sunrise Movement that puts it on the agenda are some important ways to address this crisis. Do you know what the Green New Deal is, or the Sunrise Movement? I don't know what.
Yes, I'm very familiar with it, and actually Lisa described it very well. It is actually a political movement to address all of these issues at the same time, which makes a lot of sense, because I think that's what we need to do, is to have a holistic approach. We cannot solve the climate crisis in isolation, because we have to consider the poor. We have to consider so many things, and how we move forward with every step, be it climate mitigation or adaptation. Adaptation, I mean how we deal with the climate impacts, for example, with storms, and how do we address the social issues that arise when people have to move away from low-lying coastal areas, for example. The rich people are fine; they may have a second house some other place, but the poor people, they have an issue. And the same is, with agriculture, and so we have to really, from the roots, we have to reinvent the whole order, and that's what Baha'u'llah said. That this old order is breaking down sooner or later. It's no more valid in our time. We have to build a new world order based on spiritual and ethical principles.
Someone asks an interesting question: can you give to the fund or hukukullah to help resolve the climate problem?
Absolutely. I mean, hukukullah is actually, I think, well, that's my perspective. It is a social institution. It transfers funds from the rich of the world to areas and people in need, and to projects that are beneficial to humankind. So it might, I don't know, like in the future, it might help farmers to buy seeds that are more resistant to saline soils because of less rain, because of climate change, or that they are more drought resistant, or so yes,
yeah,
I do see that.
Help with deforestation projects. There's all sorts of things that the money could go to. Exactly, that's true. Let's see. Jonathan notes, The Guardian pointed out that this long purgation via increased chain of calamities will purify humankind and give us that essential spiritual outlook, while present circumstance brings out mostly our materialistic bent, our inability to differentiate them, to address our necessities to carry forward. And that's an interesting point, that frequently today, even the coronavirus outbreak, it's often causing people to raise the barriers between nations rather than break them down. So it is an interesting point that these calamities do not always move us closer to unity, at least initially. They often drive us apart as well.
I think we see both. I think we see the very negative, narrow view, like just what is good for me, let's save me and my family, my country. But we also see how people are compassionate, how they reach out to their neighbors, how they are kind, and how they support each other, and also want to help internationally. I think we see both. And at this point, we don't know where we will, go and how long it will take for us to really go onto the positive path collectively. Very unknown.
That's true. One person says he'd like to know more about the New Deal, and someone posted an excerpt in the chat from a Wikipedia article about it. So you might want to look at that Wikipedia article and see what it has to say, because it'll elaborate on Christine's point. Peter mentions Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, a series of proposed technological solutions for that particular problem. Do you know anything about that, Christine, that you can tell us about?
This is actually, I think, the most practical resource in my view, on a societal level of what we can do. Project Drawdown actually proposes 100 practical technical solutions, and they range from it includes all economic activities of humankind, from industry to private lives to agriculture. And the first, among the first 10, and they rank them according to their effectiveness, which is really good, how much it will be beneficial to the climate to implement these so-called solutions. And among the 10 most effective ones are eliminate the refrigerants, the chemicals in the refrigerants, because they are very strong greenhouse gases that stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years and are very powerful, much more powerful than CO2. Yeah. Then another one is wind power on land. Later on, there's also wind power in the oceans, but wind power on land is more effective, probably also because it's economically easier to do. It costs less. Then another thing is the education of girls. We wouldn't think about that, but the implication on overpopulation and on many other aspects of life, it's very interesting. And then, of course, avoid food waste. Waste is the third most important one in that list. So the first one is refrigerants. The second one is wind power on land. And then the third one is avoid food waste. And that's something we all can do, avoid food waste, So that is a good resource, and I recommend everyone who is interested in practical solutions to look into Drawdown. And they have a website,
and a book, apparently.
Yeah.
Someone says it's a good book to read.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that I think it's worth mentioning at this point that I don't have numbers for, but that both wind power and solar power are now competitive. They've gotten sufficiently inexpensive so that they're competitive against many fossil fuel methods of generating electricity. And as I understand it, all of the solar and wind power in the world far exceeds the amount that human beings actually need right now. We can generate far more power from those sources than our current demand for power. So that there's actually quite an immense possibility and opportunity there for powering our society using those sources. Though, of course, the problem you have is sometimes the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. So you have to have backup systems and other ways of hauling electricity over long distances in order to prevent shortages. There's a reference here to America's Achilles heel, is the preoccupation of the Americans with freedom and entitlement, as we see with the insistence on spring break activities. How far will we have to go to enforce change rather than rely on personal responsibility? And this is a very interesting question, Charles, and it's really an internal issue for societies, and it's a big issue in our political system. How much is the change going to be driven by the government, and how much of it is something we have to help individuals to learn to do?
It's also a matter of spiritual development, I think.
Yeah.
Like what the Baha'i teachings say about freedom is the submission of our will to God. And, you know, if we see our purpose in life in serving humankind, we have a different perspective on freedom as well.
And Greg adds, surely changing the human heart would be above, you know, many of these other priorities. So that would be one way of bringing about that kind of change in personal responsibility. Yeah, there's a place where Abdu'l-Baha is asked about the village storehouse, and he talks about how people who are unable to support themselves would receive money from the village storehouse so that they can survive, you know, even though they've made an effort to work. And this, of course, gets to the classic issue of, you know, welfare, and are we creating people who are dependent upon society? And how do you avoid that? On the other hand, you can't let people starve. And the answer, of course, to that is indeed the spiritual development of people so that they don't want to be dependent on society, but will take the money if they absolutely have to. Mm-hmm. An interesting point about food waste. I think there is a lot of that going on now because people are hoarding perishable food. Interesting point. Distribution is the bottleneck. Gatekeepers of distribution netway work. So I guess that's another problem, is the distribution of things. Someone asks, will you be covering project drawdown solutions in a future webinar?
But there will be one webinar where we talk about practical solutions, and I haven't really thought about whether I want to include that, but it's quite possible I could. Yeah.
I think we may have run out of questions at the moment. I don't see anything else. Let me see if I can go back up and see if there's something I missed. Wanderer notes that the magazine available in the most bookstores called For the Betterment of the World features Baha'i community approaches to worldwide social and economic development, and many of those may have been funded through the Huququllah, which is this sort of tithe that Baha'is are not physically required to pay, but sort of spiritually, that they should pay 19% of their surplus to the fund, to the Universal House of Justice, and how they define surplus is up to them. Obviously, it doesn't include essential costs for transportation, food, and lodging, and basic costs for clothing and things, but what you consider required and what you consider an extra is completely up to you, and therefore how you define that original quantity you're paying the 19% on is completely up to you, which really pushes towards spiritual maturity and thinking about materialism and what's really necessary to live and what is superfluous. Let me see if there's anything else in here. I think we've covered most of these questions. I'm glad the question of the Green New Deal came up.
I'm wondering, unfortunately, we didn't have much time, so I restricted my presentation to the Baha'i perspectives. but it would be kind of illuminating to have some Christian perspectives as well. So if anyone is inclined to share that, that would be great.
Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, other perspectives on all of this as well. The Buddhists in particular are very concerned about a socially active form of Buddhism that looks at the Eightfold Path and looks at ways that this can be done in environmentally sustainable ways, for example, in ways that protect the environment and protect people from exploitation, because those are clearly contrary to the basic ethics of Buddhism. So there's been a lot of interest in socially engaged Buddhism, I think it's called.
Yeah.
So let's see. There's something here about, someone says, thank you to Christine for being here. Peter says, I'm finding many like-minded people to discuss these issues with, people from many religious persuasions. I find it easy to introduce spiritual principles from a Baha'i perspective. And I suspect the coronavirus outbreak in some ways does make that even easier, because we can really now talk about the need for being aware of what's going on in the world around us and the problems outside our country, and the way many societies have solved the problems that the coronavirus has caused are useful lessons for us too. So again, thank you. Everyone is thanking you, Christine. Lots and lots of comments thanking you in the chat box. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We had a marvelous discussion about global risks, and the World Economic Forum's list of risks was really quite, I think, informative, and especially the comments that you were able to find in the Baha'i writings as they relate to the challenges that humanity is facing short term and the glorious future that will be visible once we get past them. So thank you again very much. Thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.